started to ease in many countries, led by Uganda probably, including Uganda, but probably led by Uganda. This is where inflation is actually surprising everyone, thanks to the good management that has been done by government. But one factor that I wanted to point out, which we'll also talk about as an opportunity, is the food insecurity that remains so high across the region. And this has been escalated by both the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, but also the war in Ukraine. And food represents the biggest, we all know the biggest share of household consumption, especially for the poor households. But when we look at the numbers, for example, across the region, an estimated 140 million people in sub-Saharan Africa face acute food insecurity, or faced it in 2022, and up from 120 in 2021. And this number has increased this year, 2023. In East Africa, the number of people experiencing acute food insecurity rose from 41 million in 2021 to an estimated 55 million in 2022. So when we're trying to find what are the opportunities, I think these are some of the areas that we should be looking at, looking forward. The Ugandan economy, coming back to some of the issues that have been raised, has been quite resilient. But again, the risks, as mentioned, have not gone away, and they are probably on the they could be increasing because of what we have seen. So what can the country do? I mean, the budget is great, but a number of issues that we can look at. For example, in terms of rebuilding fiscal space and managing the debt that has been talked about as the elephant in the room, what can be done? Government is fully commended for the fiscal consolidation. I mean, this is unprecedented probably, but because when we were discussing these issues like 1 year, 2 years ago, everyone was so worried about the debt, the trajectory. But to see that it didn't even reach 50 and that it's actually started to slow down, that is a very positive development. The measures that have been highlighted in terms of frugality and whatever, I think need to be deeper. We've heard about the cuts in expenditure, the reduction in the fiscal deficit, but when you cut expenditure, another area that needs to be looked at is the efficiency of the spending. I think Professor Nwagaba touched a little bit about that. What exactly are we spending on within the education sector or within the health sector? Are the health centers actually critical? Are all of them that we're counting every other day that we're setting them up, are they fully functional, or we are just counting numbers in terms of addressing that issue? But also another important issue is the public administration. We've had the PS highlight, the reductions in even a moratorium that we had before on setting up administrative units. But I think as a country, we also need to think even the existing ones, because they were created for a number of reasons, but do we really need all these administrative units that are existing, or we can actually support the fiscal consolidation further by looking at some of those issues, reducing the number of our representatives, because we are a small population really compared to other countries, reducing the number of districts that we have, and so on and so forth, and all these other administrative units that increase expenditures. Revenue measures, of course, government is commended, but we could look a little bit more. Given the time, I wanted to come back quickly to the issue of tapping into the regional opportunities that are there. I think one main issue relates to the issue of diversification of trade. And that brings me back to the opportunity that has been created by the African Continent Free Trade Agreement. You know, when we talk about tapping into these opportunities, you know, we can argue that we are building a railway, but are we being strategic in terms of what we can actually export? What are we exporting? How can we support the entities, the producers, so that we have sufficient quantities that can be exported and be able to support the country, even have a stronger recovery. Uganda's potential is not just the 6%. I agree with the president, the country can grow much faster. Then the second one I wanted to highlight is the issue of opportunities to build more resilient agricultural food systems to feed Africa. Since I started talking about these issues, that is many years ago, Uganda has been termed as the food basket, and it has never transformed that potential. So we continue talking about food basket, but we need to build the more resilient agro-food systems. First, from the production side, how do we ensure that we can even produce, even if you get these shocks, climate shocks that are actually going to be increasing? How do we make sure that we do the value addition to the right things that we are going to export, and so on and so forth? To enhance productivity, I think to achieve some of this, we should be looking at enhancing productivity in primary production and access to and adoption of high quality agricultural inputs. This requires strengthening, not just putting up new structures that are going to distribute, but also looking at the regulatory environment, the land tenure issues, the input quality control issues, and fully implementing the extension reforms to increase focus on knowledge transfer amongst the producers. Secondly, there is the need to increase climate variability and pest outbreaks management in the country, and that's how the country's systems can be resilient and farmers be able to produce through the time, and work on integration integration of the farmers into the agri-food value chains, and finally to reap the benefit of the sector by strengthening the institutional processes and stakeholder coordination amongst the different stakeholders in the sectors.
Thank you very much, Rachel. A round of applause. And look through climate change financing in Uganda. Before that, the debt burden and service delivery. What's your take, Dr. Fred Muhumuza?
Thank you very much. But I wanted to refer that, and I hope he will speak from the floor, or he must come out and find a window. Dr. Kalis, you need to tell us there is El Nino syndrome going on around the planet. We are not supposed to have rain in June. Here it is raining heavily. So what do these things mean? So when I hear irrigation as a response to climate change, as PSST mentioned, the scientists need to take lead in this conversation. We haven't had them being given opportunities, and all these will come back to hit us hard. We might say inflation has gone down. I'm not sure how much of that is as a result of CBR, but a lot of our food is driven, inflation is driven by the food prices. Rachel here has just mentioned the food tensions that are already in the region. So what is the outlook like in regard of these kinds of things? So I think there are a number of pieces of information that we need to bring to the fore as we discuss the implementation of the budget. But also I must mention what we expect from the budget for what is in it for the children, what is in it for the people. It's not really just about the issue of monies being thrown out there. It's about the institution and the strategy that we are having. how does debt affect service delivery? Debt basically in our planning takes the first call on resources. So what is left is what you distribute to the rest. So if there is going to be any budget cut arising out of a shortfall in revenue, debt will not be affected. It will be all the other things. And coming for me from the perspective of my interaction with World Vision, when you talk about service delivery, you're really talking about community level. Education, it's health. Now, when I look into health, we may want to repurpose some of the resources. I'm glad the PSST has mentioned the resolution of the arrears of the interns and senior health officers, but those are the ones who have gone out. The real ones who are supposed to be in the hospitals now working and saving lives are yet to be deployed. So I would suggest that we get into the budget for skilling provision and repurpose part of that resources to make sure that the interns who are supposed to have been deployed in April get in before this year begins. Because this is not only skilling the people who have received their skills to really certify that they can deliver, but you're also saving lives. Every day I receive information of deaths in hospitals as a result of these individuals. So we cannot run a budget when we are losing out on people. I also want to emphasize things of that the PSST has mentioned. We need to get into the active laws. We have already talked about no new institutions of public administration, but what are we doing with the existing ones? Same thing should go to the fleet. No new vehicles, but we need to offload the existing fleet. It's already a menace to the government budget when I look through the numbers that go into this. So rationalization real of government should not only be restricted to agencies. It was about rationalization of agencies and public expenditure. If we are having struggles in rationalizing agencies, can we rationalize public expenditure? Can we really get in and see what are the ministries spending on? What can we save? The danger with cutting budgets without actually deleting the agency is you create arrears. Because as long as this agency hasn't been rationalized, if you don't give it a budget, it continues to rent where it is, it continues to accumulate arrears. So the real way of behaving and disciplining the budget is to remove the spending entities. And this is what happened in the 90s, where you say retrenchment, demobilization, you must remove this entity that sucks your budget. Because if you don't give it, it continues to create arrears. We have seen them in water, where government agencies have not paid for water for ages. So we need to go more and deeper into these conversations. I know some people would say we want to save jobs, but when you improve the economy, you create other jobs elsewhere. This is what happened when Uganda Breweries and UCB was sold. The jobs were lost. But look at where the banking sector is today. There was Uganda Posts and Telecommunications. It was rationalized. Where is the telecom sector today? So let's not look at where we are today and try to save the pennies and lose the pounds. So I think the message out there needs to be stronger. It needs to be more focused and practical if we are to really hit the road running by solving the issues of fiscal discipline. You cannot reduce debt again without going into the planning stage. I'm glad the president has taken on this center stage. I'm still hearing we are going to spend 2 billion on the SGR, but we have to spend another 100 million on the meter gauge. Now, you want to reconcile that. I can understand the cost of transport, but I'm also looking down south. Tanzania has brought their standard gauge railway. They are coming up to Malaba. To Mwanza. If Kenya comes to Malaba, shouldn't I rethink my strategy? These are, for me, the ideas that I think are not yet coming through. And yet, if they came through, they would give us the very efficiencies we're looking for. We're talking about subsidies. You mentioned, I think, Nwagaba mentioned subsidizing fuel. Why are we subsidizing commercial farmers to give them free tractors? And next, they are asking us to establish tractor repair centers. You want to look through some of these kinds of things. I don't find a lot of complete logic. The logic is in there where we want to go, but we want to really move there strategically and very fast. We do not have time on our side. I think my 3 minutes might be over. If they are not, I'll borrow more from somebody, but that is later.
Thank you very much. A round of applause to Dr. Fred Muhumuza. Let us now go to you, Mr. Ronald Kagwa, Manager of Production, Trade and Tourism. climate change financing in Uganda, but I also later want to request Dr. Kalist to take us through the cost of climate change on our economy. But before that, you could go first.
Thank you very much. Yes, climate change poses, costs to the economy. But as far as NDP3 is concerned, climate change has been factored in NDP3. From our Vision 2040, all our development plans that we have had and supposed to cascade down to the local government and be implemented through our national budgets. Now, we reviewed this budget for compliance to climate change. Now, we discovered that the compliance was unsatisfactory at 55.35%. This is lower than what we had last year, where compliance was 64.7%. Now, what are the issues behind this low level of compliance? Now, 23-24 budget, the interventions that were, put forward to have the first call on the resources did not look at climate change. The first call on resources was given to wage and statutory obligations, fixed costs, multi-year commitments, and policy commitments. So this in itself did not look at climate change as one of the key issues that should have the first call on resources. We also want to note that the 40% budget cut that we had because of COVID left no option for many of our MDAs. They look at climate change as not one of their core mandates. Therefore, it was one of the vulnerable areas to cut. So we saw a lot of MDAs cutting their budgets on climate change budgets. But I also want to note that our economy is based on natural resource, our export base, tourism, fish exports. All these are natural resource based sectors which are vulnerable to climate change. So our even PDM, which is a front line program of government in this budget, PDM will be based on agriculture and natural resource based sectors, which are vulnerable to climate change. So climate change has a lot of implications to our economy. I want to assure you that the droughts, the floods, the losses in our biodiversity, all have got implications on our economic growth targets, implications on our macroeconomic stability, implications on employment, and even the value, the inflation that we are proud of is likely, may be, affected by this. Of course, the dependency on this natural resource, climate change has the potential to raise poverty levels if we don't do anything. We've just mentioned the Katonga Road, the bridge, which was a combination of environmental mismanagement of the wetland, and climate change. Now, going to Masaka, you have to add on 180 kilometers. The road is now 180 kilometers, and we don't know the cost of rebuilding this bridge. The floods in mountain areas like Western Uganda, Eastern Uganda, Mountain Elgon, all these have had issues of displacement of our people, issues of limited access to health services, issues of insecurity. All these have come up as a result. But in terms of climate change, I want also to note that climate change provides opportunities as well, which we need to identify and exploit. Many countries in the region have looked at climate change as an opportunity to mobilize non-conventional sources of raising revenue. Innovative instruments have come up to cover the fiscal deficit, So let us look at climate change as another dimension of it and build resilient economies. It has the capacity, if we invest in climate change, we have the capacity to build resilient and inclusive economies. Inclusiveness is, if you want to get inclusiveness, the best investment is a natural resource because it's where the majority of our people are. And this is dependent on environment and natural resources. Of course, we applaud the government for the small-scale power, solar-powered irrigation. I think that is critical. Our prayer is that it is affordable, it is inclusive, it is everywhere in our country.
You have a minute.
Yes, irrigation schemes, these are very good. The small animals that were mentioned, I think all these are very, very critical. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronald. A round of applause. I will call later Dr. Kalis because the subject you talked about, maybe to expound on that. And also, after the two panelists, I'll also invite Margaret to come in front. But let us now hear from Mr. Andrew Mwenda. Options, the political economy of rationalizing MDAs and financing the financial year 2023-2024 national budget. Andrew.
Thank you very much, my grandson, Patrick Kamara. And of course, your cousin, I have to thank your cousin, my other grandson, Arthur Bainomjisha, for inviting me here. I feel very pleased because on my right-hand side, he seated a man I really admire very much. He taught me economics in Mwiri, and I got an A. So the man you see here is a very big influence. Mr. Kagwa is a big influence in my life. The economist in me was created by him. So if I speak poorly, you know it's because of him. And I'm not supposed to speak economics, but political economy. I did a paper, I think, for a code in the year 2007, which Godber decided to abrogate and write and put the appendage's name on the mushrooming semi-autonomous government agencies and all these agencies that they are right now trying to take back to ministries. And at that time, the argument I was making is that the way the donors sought to promote liberal economic reform in Uganda, let me see my time. The way donors thought to create liberal economic reform was to create a domestic constituency within the bureaucracy that supports their reform ideas. And they found the civil service, which was traditional, was resistant to the ideas they wanted to put across. So in order to implement liberal reforms, they had to bypass the mainstream bureaucracy and create these semi-autonomous government agencies and commissions, which would be staffed by persons. They would take to Washington, D.C., to Oxford, to Harvard. They do internships, they do fellowships, and they get indoctrinated in this idea of the free market. So they were able to create an elite core within the bureaucracy that identifies ideologically with their vision of Uganda, and therefore they can bypass the mainstream public service to implement these reform programs. So that is Uganda Revenue Authority, Uganda Investment Authority, when they had to disband electricity to create these electricity agencies, electricity distribution, electricity generation. All these agencies came like that. But there was a convergence of different but compatible interests between the government and the donors. The government of President Yoweri Museveni itself needed to co-opt many elites in order to win their support or to silence them. If they were opponents, they would win them over. If they were supporters, they could be rewarded. So the creation of these agencies provided the government a significant opportunity of providing so many jobs for very many of its supporters without having to remove people from the public service and dismiss them. So we see a convergence of different but compatible interests. Now, 500 years later, because remember Museveni has been in power for 500 years now, 500 years later, things are changing. The government of Uganda is saying, we need to rationalize. These agencies are too much. They have taken usurped the powers of the civil service. We need to eliminate them. So we should ask ourselves, what has changed? Two things have changed on both sides. One, the donors have lost influence on the policy making and policy orientation in Uganda and policy implementation. They have also lost influence on institution building. Part of that is because of the emergence of China as a major source of funding. Part of it is that Uganda's economy has grown. The government of Uganda has greater resources now to finance a significant share of its budget. There was a time 60% of Uganda's budget was financed by the donors. If you look at this year's budget, which is 53 trillion, 8 trillion of that is rolled over debt, 17 trillion or 16.3 trillion is loan repayments. So essentially, the money available in the kitty to spend is 28 trillion. That's the only money in the budget. But the government projected revenues are 29.7 trillion. Essentially, right now, if Uganda does not have debt, it can finance its own budget. It no longer needs the donors. Total government revenues today will finance the total budget the government is going to fund if you remove debt repayments. So I think the government, now that it is on its own, the donors have lost, the Western donors have lost influence. China has become a financier. The government no longer needs these institutions. The second part of it, the political economy of them, is that you see, these institutions also, this mainstream bureaucracy has over the last 500 years been won over by the NRM. I mean, remember that the average age of Uganda is 16 years. If you go to the civil service, the average age of a civil servant in Uganda is about 30. These old people you see, are very few. The Keith Makanis, you can see they are dying off. So they have died. The Chris Kasamis, the Mutabiles. So the current civil service of Uganda was recruited under Museveni. It may not support him politically, but because of the opportunities for corruption that they indulge in and they don't get punished, they want to maintain the status quo. And therefore, the civil service is on the side of, is supportive of the government. The donors have been sidelined. So it is time to rationalize. It is time to wrestle power back from these specialized Western donor-driven agencies back into the mainstream civil service. Now, the final comment on it. Of course, like all reforms of government, they are trying to throw away the baby with the bathwater. If you look at this rationalization, take the example, I think they recommended that IRS, Insurance Regulatory Authority, should be taken back to the Ministry of, to the Bank of Uganda, as a department of Bank of Uganda. Remember, the idea is to reduce government expenditure on these agencies, right? In order to reduce government costs. But IRS is not funded by government. It raises money from insurance companies. They make a contribution. It's funded that way. It has enough money. They have even put up a 14-story building in Nakasero on their own money. So government thinks it is saving money when it is. There is URSB. URSB, I think in 2019, collected 53 billion, spent 27. The other 26 billion went to the treasury. URSB essentially is funding the government. Now they're saying they are closing it. And when there was a department in the Ministry of Justice, they were collecting 6 billion a month. A year. So their revenues had grown in a few years they were created. Government didn't even know. I am the one who had to go and tell the president, but why? Then you had the WHO at that time. I think their total revenue was 127 billion. In 2019, they spent something like 87 billion, and they had 40 billion surplus. They even had the money on fixed deposit accounts in the banks. They were even investing in real estate. On Kanjocha Street, they have a tall office block building. Government is saying it wants to cut costs and take them back to the Ministry of Tourism, which costs their self-revenue generating entity. So I think that the rationalization was good to reduce a multiplicity of government agencies in order to make at that time and up to now, I feel like a reform by addition is not a good way. If you want to reform a public service, you must reform by transformation rather than by addition. So, which is good. So that what they're doing is good, but I hope that somebody has sense and they identify the institutions that need to be closed and merged and those that actually don't need to. I also don't think that UNRWA should be shut down. I don't think it should be taken back to the Ministry of Works. I think with that I should do. Have I finished my 4 minutes?
Yes, you have.
You are lying. But anyway, I'll give my extra minute to my grandson because he was in Mwiri with me, but Kagwa did not teach him, so his economics cannot be as good. Let me say, I've given you my 1 minute.
Okay, old man of that. You know, there's the head of the clan, so just the old man. Okay, Ms. Alan, options for an inclusive and resilient private sector for economic growth.
All right, now I'm in trouble. On my right hand is a Mwenda who was taught by a Kagwa, who was teaching economics, who I ran away from to do sciences. I ran all the way to the Dr. Muhumuza's Odoliberalism in Germany, came back to sit with PSST in the academic world to do the budget of Uganda. That is how difficult this thing called economics is all about. Now, from the private sector. The challenge we have in the private sector is we look at the statistics and the facts on the ground, and we ask ourselves, how do we move forth? I'll just give a grimsy, yet I'll appreciate the government for that. We're in a country where we have about 45, 49 million people, give or take, depending on the statistics you're using. All right. So of that, you have about 23 million who are in the labor force. Of that, you have about 2 million of those who are actually registered within NSSF. That means those who payee. With that, you have about 10 million of them who are actually employed. And with that, you have about 9 out of 10 of the whole entire task force being informal. You have 72% of your population in agriculture, contributing to 23% of your GDP. You have about 2 million people in manufacturing, or what you call industry, contributing about 25% of your GDP. And you have about 5 to 7 million of your people who are in trade and allied services, who are contributing about 52% of your GDP. Of those same people, the 72% are contributing to 1 to 2% of your taxes. The people in manufacturing who are contributing 23% of your GDP are contributing 33% of your taxes. And yes, the ones who are contributing 52% of your GDP are contributing 66% of your taxes. Difficult task to deal with. So what are we doing in the private sector? Or what have we noted? My name is Alan Senyondo, by the way. I am in charge of the Economic Recovery and Resilience Response Program at the Private Sector Foundation. My CEO is not feeling well, so I'm representing. Now, pardon me? All right, so the issue at hand is, how do you get this economy to be more productive and to produce more? We have talked about the budgeting sphere, and we have seen where the money is. There are opportunities in that budget for the private sector and every one of us. The question is, why are we growing at 6%? Please recall, your population is growing at 3.2%. So that means what you're feeling in your pocket is only 3%. So how do we get this economy to move? And the first thing we talk about is, how do we organize the private sector? I'll give an example. We organize the people in the milk, thanks to government, the milk sector. We began producing the milk, and oops, the milk has now been stopped from going to Kenya. So question at hand, how do we organize the private sector, both at the demand side and the supply side? If we're producing so much milk, can we get the milk into a school feeding program to stimulate that sector? That is number one. So about organizing, you need to organize the agriculture sector better. You need to organize the manufacturing sector better. You need to organize the trading sector better. And yes, indeed, thanks to government we need to organize the tourism sector because of the $690 million, which they potentially can bring in. So that is one area we are really dealing with, organizing the private sector. Number two, after organizing the private sector, how do you then move forward to ensure that you have markets for the goods and services the private sector produces? Yes, we are within the East African community, and we are within COMESA, and yes, the African Continental Free Trade Area is moving on. The question is, are we able to produce enough? Now, what we have been having is, yes, we are all producing these things, but we are all wanting to go to the market. That's not how the markets work. Markets work through organized movement. How many tons can you bring in at a time? Are you able to bring in hundreds of thousands of tons of goods through one individual, through one organization? So how do you organize yourselves around markets so that you're able to export? And I'm trying to wrap up. So through the invite and grow programs of government, we think we're able to move there. And now, because I'm running very fast, there's an element we have to think about of the private sector, which is capacity building through skills training. Now, Dr. Nwagaba, you've talked about the duale system. Duale system is the dual system of the Germans, where basically, I always like to say this, only 23% of the German people between the age of 18 and 45 have ever seen the inside of a university. They don't need to go to university. What are we doing in Uganda? We are producing more generals than corporals. Where are our corporals? In the tertiary institutions. So we need to think very carefully, how do we develop the tertiary institutions so that the generals can manage the corporals? Otherwise, we're going to have a situation where the corporals may end up managing the generals. Last but not least, with all that said and done, our other main task is how do we get to advocate for the private sector, so that even as we speak for the budget, in the budget, the issues concerning the private sector are well embedded in there. And that is why we have those engagements with government all the time. So those are the opportunities we think we are dealing with in the budget. Thank you.
Alan from PSFU, thank you so much. May I now invite Margaret Kakande, Head Budget Monitoring and Accountability Unit, Minister of Finance. Maybe 3 minutes. Then, before I open the plenary, we shall have first Dr. Kalis to speak to us on climate change matters.
So good afternoon. I'm choosing my own topic. I'm going to talk about funding gender and equity. How responsible is the budget for this financial year? So first of all, I want to say that we all know it's now a legal requirement for us to budget for gender and equity. And if you look at the assessments, in theory, we complied because everybody, I think, got 69% in terms of compliance. So you can say, yeah, that the budget is compliant. But actually, if you dig down into the budget and you look at the two-pronged approach that we're using in terms of funding, then maybe you can see issues. So if you look at the first approach, we look at universal programs. We can fund equity and gender through universal programs. About 40% of the budget can address issues of gender and equity through the universal programs, supposedly. So if you pick any of the programs, for example, you're talking about financial inclusion, which is going to be pivotal in terms of transformation. Women, the youth, they should be able to benefit if, I want to emphasize the if these people are aware of what is going on. So if the women know about these programs, they should benefit. So I think that the details should be in the way we are executing the programs. Are we creating awareness in terms of what we are providing as government for them to be able to take advantage of the programs? So that's where we have the question mark. But if you look at the specifics, I think we've put about 12.7 billion in the budget for specific activities for gender and equity, of course, plus the $217 million for GROW, the project for women. So there you can say the women are going to benefit in terms of transformation and in terms of benefiting from the budget. But having said that, I think there are some areas where I see challenges, where I think we should maybe step back and take a look in terms of what should we have done differently. We have a gender unit, for example, in the Ministry of Education. And this has been a unit which drives mainstreaming of gender in a critical area. And the funding has declined. So there, I think we have an issue. And always people raise the issues of funding for the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development, and argue that if you really talk about issues of equity and gender, we should see money in that ministry. And I think the money that we are putting in as a government is not adequate. But having said that, I also want to quickly say that they have a lot of budget support. So, but we shouldn't sit back as a government and say, let's leave a critical ministry for dealing with the issues of gender and equity to development partners to fund. We should really step up our funding as government to the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development instead of just leaving it to off-budget support. But if you look at a number of areas which are critical for looking at issues of equity, like health, I think we are doing well. We are putting a lot of money in a number of programs and projects for women. We have now women hospitals. We are putting a bit of money in maternal health, child health, which is a good thing. And also in education, there are a number of things that are coming through the budget in terms of funding to look at issues of children, the girl child, and so on. But of course, we still have challenges of STEM. We are talking about sciences, but how much money or how much are we doing to ensure that actually the girls can take up sciences? Now everything is talking about sciences, but most of the girls are still in the arts. Even when you go to the university, most of them are in arts. So we are losing out in terms of where the government is focusing vis-a-vis where the females are. So in a nutshell, I can say that we have intent. I think we have good intentions as government in terms of funding issues of inequality, but I think our challenge will be in terms of effective implementation of what we are saying in terms of the universal programs. Make sure that those people actually know. Women are smart, very smart. If they know about these things, I'm sure they can take advantage. But usually you find that in a number of programs, they don't know. For example, we have a big program in Bank of Uganda, the SCF. And people didn't know about this program, which was supposed to be for funding farmers. And now we even have an arm for funding SMEs, in terms of looking at issues of farming and so on. But we don't create awareness. So I think we should actually put a bit of money into the program for community mobilization and mindset change. Because if you look at that program, which is really critical in terms of people knowing what is going on, in terms of what are their roles, what should they expect from government, I think we have a small budget in that program, which should actually help in terms of resolving some of these issues. The way you look at me, I know you want to pull me away from here, so I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret Kakande, there for taking us through financing gender and equity interventions. Another round of applause for Margaret. Thank you very much. And so at this juncture, let me very quickly call Dr. Calixte Tindemugaye, who will take us through the cost of climate change on our economy and East Africa. Very briefly, sir. And after that, I'm going to open the discussion so that you can also give us your ideas.
Thank you very much, moderator. Good evening, everybody. Maybe before I talk about the cost, I really would want to put the issue of climate change into context, because sometimes we take it simplistically. I think when we are talking about climate change, it is finding us already with many other shocks. Environment degradation. If you see how the environment in the whole country is degraded, it's already another shock. So when we talk about climate change, we are already talking about a problem that is finding us already weak. Now, how does climate change actually manifest itself? The water environment is the best medium through which you know that there is climate change. Too much water, resulting in floods. Too little water, resulting in drought. Too dirty water, that results actually in pollution and death. And of course, landslides. So again, when we talk about the costs, we should look at it in that way. That actually climate change is manifesting itself in many ways, and when it finds the environment already degraded, then it even causes more harm. If again, colleagues have talked about Katonga, and it is still fresh in our minds. The road was destroyed, it has been put back. Don't be surprised if it is washed away tomorrow. Have we actually internalized what caused the road to be washed away? I just give you some facts. We have done some work. In Katonga, the catchment is an area that contributes water to a common point. It is highly degraded. There is a bridge that connects Gomba and Karungu that actually has culverts. Because of environmental degradation, all the culverts have been filled by silt. So the water was not flowing. So the water came up, rose by 3 meters with a lot of pressure. It washed that road, and the road is the one which caused the problem at Katonga. Have we addressed that problem? So again, while we are moving, and I really would want us to, again, Honourable Minister, to appreciate that we are putting infrastructure in place. But are we actually making the infrastructure resilient to the shocks, environmental shocks, climate shocks? Otherwise, we might be taking 2 steps forward and 3 steps backwards. And we are seeing it. We have Kasese. We have a project we are working in Kasese. Hospitals were washed away, roads, bridges, schools. After washing away, we get money to put them back. And then we cause problems. So again, I know we always talk about infrastructure, and in the midst of water, we're actually implementing infrastructure. But we really would want to make this infrastructure resilient to the shocks. If we don't do it, roads are being destroyed because of water. We're actually discussing with the Ministry of Works to set up a program on roads for water and water for roads, so that you use roads as water harvesting structures, but also we can protect roads. But how do we work together if a budget is for a road, and say water is probably some of the measures we are talking about may even be termed as consumptive. When we talk about climate change, again, we are seeing a lot of damages. Infrastructure being damaged, people are being displaced, And of course, ecosystems are also being destroyed. We have done some work to determine the cost of these damages. And these damages, the costs are increasing. Annually, we estimate that between 20 and 30 million US dollars are being lost because of these damages. And probably maybe the investment you need to make these infrastructure climate resilient could be about 10% of this money. But you can actually save that money. And the figures are going up. By the year 2025, we estimate that, which is not far from now, it will have increased to about 40 to 234 million. But as we continue, if we don't take action, it will even go as high as 460 million US dollars annually. So again, to recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that the programs we are putting in place in the budget are good. But there are a few things we need to tweak. We always talk about parish development model, and the colleagues have talked about it. We are talking about people depending on natural resources. But are these resources actually being managed so that they are available today and tomorrow? Water. Again, what I mean, so we're talking about irrigation, and we are putting irrigation schemes. But is the water there? Assuming you put in an irrigation scheme, do we know whether the water is available? And are we putting in place measures to ensure that the water is available? Hydropower schemes. Right now, hydropower schemes are generating power in the rainy season. In the dry season, many of them are almost dry. Again, that's why again we put in place measures within those areas where the water is coming from to make them actually resilient. So again, little amount of money that can make our infrastructure actually become more and more productive. We have estimated that we need about 28 billion US dollars to actually make our investments climate resilient. Again, it's not only just water, it's all the economy to make it climate resilient. And of course, that is over 10 years. So we're estimating that if we get about 2.8 per year, 2.8 billion per year, this will improve the resilience of the infrastructure, and we need to move forward. Again, we need to build the capacity of the people on the ground. We have programs where we are actually initiating programs, creating water and environment cooperatives around the parishes. And we are getting people being responsible to manage these resources, and it's supplementing the parish development model. And I feel the people on the ground need, first of all, to know how to plan, to utilize the resource and manage them so that we move forward. Again, PDM is there, but we can add a few components to make sure that the PDM interventions are climate resilient. So, a moderator, just to mention that the current